Welcome to our second session. For this session, we'll be joined by Phil Borges, who in our previous panel talked about how he chooses what stories to tell. For this session, he will be talking to us about the contradictory traditional beliefs against the Western mindset in dealing with mental health. Phil Borges has been documenting indigenous cultures for over 30 years, and his project Stirring the Fire looked at women breaking gender barriers worldwide. With Crazy Wise, his film project, he has delved into the applications of traditional indigenous beliefs in the Western society. This film is playing at the Zurich Riff Raff Theatre on Saturday at 11 a.m. Please join me in welcoming Phil Borges to the stage.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you. Thank you, Chris. And I just want to say what an honor it is for me to be here with you guys. I was speaking to a lot of the organizers of the conference last night, and it just gave me so much hope that the awareness level, the lack of apathy, the engagement of you people is something that will help me sleep better at night. I mean, to think that we have this generation coming up that will be taking care of us is really comforting. So one of the things that I think you have such a privilege is to be going to school with people from different cultures, different countries. And when I went to high school in the 50s, it was pretty much uniform. I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I didn't even leave my country till I was 27 years old, and I took a trip to Mexico. But what I have learned in going back and forth between these cultures that are living the way we all lived centuries ago has really been a huge education for me. And that's when I really started to understand my culture. So one of the things I want to do today is take you through one of my learnings. And it is about how we look in the Western culture at non-ordinary states of consciousness, how we look at mental health. So it started for me really when I was doing a project in Tibet, and I was invited to watch a young monk known as a Kutan go into trance and do what we would call channel the protector spirit of the Tibetan people, known as the Nechung Oracle. And it was somewhat fantastic to watch this ceremony. The monks started beating their drums and chanting. He went into trance and started talking in this different voice. He eventually collapsed. They had to carry him out of the room. And I was looking at this and I was thinking, is this a ritualistic drama? Is this superstition? You know, I was skeptical of what it was all about. And a little bit later, I got to spend some time around the Dalai Lama, and I really saw how this man who is the leader of these people who are living in exile now was such an authentic guy. And I've always been suspicious of leaders, but and then I heard him say, when he was asked about the Kutan, he said, somebody asked him, do you really make your decisions of state based on what this guy that goes into trance is saying? And he said, his answer was, you know, if we completely relied on the Kutan for our decisions, that would be extreme. But if we completely ignored him, that would be extreme. So it was like they were using this balance of reason and intuition to make their decisions. So now do we have sound? We should have sound. There we go. So this is a group, I just want to give you a glimpse of how a shaman goes into trance. Because I started seeking out these people like the Kutan. They go into altered states of consciousness. Now he's doing a ceremony for a young kid that has a sickness. And you'll see it's pretty wild what they go through. With them themselves into a trance-like state while life goes on around them. And these are the reindeer herders up in northern Mongolia, the Satan people. Now he's coming out of his trance-like state. Coming back into this reality, so to speak. So I started searching out the healers. I was mainly doing human rights stories around the world. And whenever I'd go into a community, I'd ask, who are your healers here? Who are your visionaries? Who are your priests? And this is Linza. She's a very well-known shaman in eastern Siberia. Sakulin, a mother of 5, a predictor and a healer in the Samburu tribe in northern Kenya. Mengatui, all these shaman, as we call them, they go by different names in their own tribes, but all these people go into their trance and induce it in a different way. The drum is big in Mongolia. In the Ecuadorian Amazon, they use plant medicine, mainly ayahuasca, to go into the trance. This is a medicine man on the Navajo Nation in Arizona, and they use drumming. This is Namad, another Mongolian shaman. So I ended up interviewing about 40 of these shaman in different parts of the world: Africa, Asia, South America, the Arctic Circle, all over. And almost every community I went into had somebody that would go into an altered state of consciousness to serve as a healer or a visionary for their community. And the thing that united them, and every time I interviewed them, was the way they were chosen as young people. And it was typically a crisis. And sometimes it was a physical crisis, like a big sickness that they had, a very strong sickness. But most often it was a mental emotional crisis, something that we might call psychosis. They were hearing voices, having visions, having personality changes. Their mood swings were violent. Their dreams were very intense. And that would identify them as having shamanic capability. And so mostly, this is some of the common things I heard. There was this call, either a physical or a psychological crisis. Then they went through this initiation, and they looked at this initiation as a little death. And it was a dying of their old way of being in the world, who they were, and coming into this whole new way of living in the world, or the way they viewed the world. So this kind of death and rebirth. And then once they went through that initiation, they started their service to the community. And either they were a healer or visionary. Sometimes they were the priest, the leader of the community. And typically this was done without compensation. They weren't paid to do this. If they were a goat herder, they would still have to herd their goats. And they would usually do this for free. Actually, Namad, who I stayed with her for 2 days, and in her little gur, her little round tent that she lived in, while she was seeing clients, one after another. And I gave her $30 or $40, something like that, to stay there. And that was kind of a fortune for her. And she ended up taking that and giving it away to all her patients that were coming in. So they're not paid for what they do. It's it's hard for us to conceive. But it was a very different way of being. So let me get back to the beginning here. So that was all just a curiosity to me. I was doing human rights work mainly. I was doing this on the side. And until 5 years ago, when I started a film on meditation, I'd been meditating for a couple of years, and I just wanted to do a small film and ask people, what are you getting out of it? What is it? What do you see changing in your life with your practice? And I met Adam. And Adam had had a break when he was 20 years old and was put on medication, told he had a chemical imbalance of his brain. His brain was essentially broken. There was no cure for it, but he could be maintained on medications for the rest of his life. And so he was on medications for 4 years. He had terrible side effects. He cut off his medications, and he did this 10-day silent meditation retreat, and it stabilized him. And it's a very dangerous thing to do. I've since learned to stop all medications like that. They have severe withdrawal issues, and it was amazing that he could do that, and it pulled him through. So I started documenting Adam and just following him over the years, and ended up following him for that full 5-year period of time. And if you want to see Crazy Wise, you'll see the arc that his story went through. But while doing the film, and by the way, I have absolutely no background in mental health. I took a Psych 1A class in 1962 at Berkeley, and that was it. And so when you do a documentary film, you're pretty much doing a research project, immersed completely in it. And so I started interviewing psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health workers, and especially people with lived experience, people that had successfully navigated a mental emotional crisis. And here's some of the things I learned. First of all, this is stats from the United States, from the National Institute of Mental Health. 1 in 5 Americans will suffer one of these crises in their lifetime. They're very common. I didn't realize that. The other thing that was surprising is 75% of them occur before the age of 24. So mainly in your age group, our young people are the people that suffer these crises. And it seems like any time during our development as humans, when we're in those periods where our identity's changing, adolescence, 50% happen in adolescence, when the hormones are all changing. Going away to college, that's a big one. So that was news to me. And the other thing I learned during that time was the World Health Organization did this cross-cultural study of 9 countries, and several in Europe, United States, Canada, and then these 3 developing countries, Nigeria, Colombia, India, and they just looked at the rate of recovery from a psychological crisis. How many went into severe schizophrenia? How many recovered and went back to work or resumed their normal life? And it turned out that the recovery rate in the developing world was much higher than it was in the developed world. And so with all our sophisticated pharmacology, our experts that have gone through school studying all the different classes of mental illness, these countries that had none of that, they were recovering much faster. They did the study in 1969. They couldn't believe the results, so they repeated it in 1978, got the same results. Those results were criticized because of the methods they used to measure. They did it again in 1997, got the same results. The World Health Organization came to the conclusion that being in a developed country is a strong predictor of not attaining complete remission from one of these crises. So, the shaman's advantage that I saw, the cultural context which they hold. First of all, they don't pathologize hearing voices, having visions. That's normal to them. It's the person speaking with their ancestors. So they look at that as just kind of a normal part of life. The second thing is the person who is having these issues, they're told, you know, you've got a very special sensitivity. And yes, it's difficult. And you're going to have to learn to work with your energies that are coursing through you, but you can learn that. And we're going to give somebody to teach you how to do that. And the person we're going to teach you with is your mentor, is someone who's been through it, an older shaman that has already gone through that process of learning how to handle those sensitivities. And their initiation usually goes on for a year or two, and then they become somebody that has an important role in their society. So to me, what popped into my mind, you look at the difference. Does anybody know what placebo effect? Do you know what placebo is? Yes. You can give somebody a sugar pill, and if it comes from an authority like a doctor, just that suggestion will help the person get better. So if you look at the placebo effect of these two narratives, the narrative, you know, you've got a chemical imbalance of your brain. Your brain isn't working right now. We can't fix it, but we can kind of tamp down your emotions so you don't feel quite as much, and you can lead a somewhat normal life. So that's frightening if you're told that your brain isn't working right. And then on top of that, you're given a label. And this label usually carries a lot of stigma. If you're called bipolar, especially schizoaffective or schizophrenic, you're not going to get a job that easy. You're probably not going to find a mate that easily. And so it's fear and isolation, some of the worst things you can do for mental health. On the other hand, the shaman, you know, you've got a special sensitivity. It's difficult. You can learn to work with it. We're going to help you do that. And when you get through this, when you learn who you are and how to handle who you are and how to work with your gifts in this case, you're going to be very important to us. They're given hope. They're given meaning, they're given purpose. And the placebo effect of that is immense. And it turns out that one of the drugs, the medications that started the whole pharmacological renaissance in the late 80s was Prozac. And we just had the Freedom of Information Act come out where we could look at all the tests that they ran. It turns out that Prozac was 82% placebo. So, and it's always been placebo. We try to get rid of the placebo effect because that's a distraction from what really works when there is so much power in it. So whether this is true, whether the way the indigenous people look at a strong mental emotional crisis is true is beside the point. It's how it affects the individual that really struck me and something I wanted to make a statement about. The other thing that indigenous people have that we've somewhat lost is a strong, personal, intimate social network. And this is a scene I've seen many times. You know, I thought this woman had twins. Her child is on the left. Child on the right is somebody she's babysitting. I've seen this over and over again where a woman will pass her baby to somebody else while she has to go and do something, and that woman may have to go and chase a goat that's run away, and she'll pass the baby to someone else. So the kids are kind of raised communally. They don't have the institutions we have. They don't have child care centers. They don't have old age homes. They don't have social security. The only thing they have is their relationships with one another. And they have to keep those very strong in order to survive. So very strong social network. This is Erpi. She's 13 years old. She lives in this little hut with her great-grandmother, her grandparents, her 6 brothers and sisters, an orphan that they've adopted. all living in that one little hut. And her great-grandmother was dying, and she was mourning her great-grandmother. And while the woman was in this hut dying, people were coming out of the mountains from miles around to say goodbye to her. And this is somebody, she was in her 90s, so these were all the people that she had known throughout her life. And it was just a couple of weeks after that that I was in New York doing a piece for an NGO that ran old age homes. And I just saw these people in these very clean environments, taken care of by strangers, really, to them. And it was such a contrast to me. So that strong social network is extremely important. They also have this connection to nature and the spirit world. And you see this in many ways. This is Malik and Yasmina. Yasmina's about 5 years old. Malik is in her 90s. And they are best friends. They spend all their time together in the garden working. And I've often asked the tribal people, you know, why the oldest and the youngest like this in pairs? And they would say, you know, this is very natural. The Yasmina has just come out of the spirit world. Malik is about to go back into the spirit world. They actually have a lot in common. So they kind of look at life as this continuum. You know, they speak with their ancestors. They leave food at the table for the ancestors. So there's this continuous existence between this reality and the other spiritual reality. So this is one of the little towns in northern Finland that took on a whole new way of addressing mental emotional crises. And it's called Torino. The town is a town of about 70,000 people, a very modern town. They had the highest level of schizophrenia in Western Europe, and they were able to lower it to the lowest level over a 25-year period. And what they did was call a process, the psychological community, engaged in a process called open dialogue. And the first thing they did, instead of just isolating the person and saying, this is your problem, this is what's wrong with you, they engaged the whole social network. They brought in the parents, if that was important. They also brought in the lovers or the employers, the best friends, and they would sit and talk about what was going on with all of them, what they were feeling. And they had clinical staff there, but there was no hierarchy. It wasn't the doctor speaking down to the person saying, this is what's wrong with you. It wasn't what's wrong with you. It was what's happened to you, what's going on with you, what's the meaning behind what you're experiencing. More of a curiosity than telling them what's going on. And they also very conservative use of medication. So a lot of their sayings are be with instead of do to, drop the clinical gaze, stop looking for what's wrong with the person. So they took this whole different approach and found it very successful. So the last thing I want to talk about is the Crazy Wise film was kind of about that narrative, the paradigm that we're using to describe mental emotional distress and how harmful it could be in and of itself. But the other thing that's really interesting to me now is how these breaks, the people that go into these altered states, there is a sense of unity and just a spiritual aspect to these breaks. And so the word spiritual has a lot of baggage attached to it. So here's a psychiatrist from UCLA that's talking about how he defines it.
I became a teacher and was really excited to learn as much as I could about the mind. And as a scientist, I had to say that there's so much we don't know. So for me as a scientist working in the realm of subjective suffering as a clinician, it really became important to just be open to everything. And then it turns out there's this whole mindfulness community which overlaps with the spiritual community, which when I've taught recently in spiritual conferences, I say to the folks, I don't know what spirituality is because I've never used the term before. Please teach me. They say spirituality is two things. It's a sense of being connected to something larger than this bodily self, and it's a sense of deep meaning of the purpose of life. So I go, wow, if that's what spirituality is, let's go for it, because that's really clear. I don't see any separation of the disciplined practice of spirituality and the disciplined practice of science.
So I really have heard this over and over again of people in those states. I felt this extreme sense of connection. Here's how Adam described it. He's our main character, our main subject in the film.
I was always just very excited. I was just the happy kid. And throughout high school, everything, life was just beautiful. I was 20. It was 4 days after my 20th birthday, I went nuts. So when it first occurred, it was very fun and exciting. It was the first time my mind, it was like this breakthrough. In a weird sense, it was like a breaking of my ego in a lot of the ways that just different thought processes and things that in a lot of ways were holding me back. It was just this total shattering, and my mind just opened, and I started thinking of all these different things. And in that sense, it was beautiful. I found it was how I found the first time I had ever experienced a real connection to the universe, where I really felt like a part of this, that I was this was me. It was just like incredible. And so yeah, just absolutely amazing. And then I kept going. And then I went way too far. And then it got scary.
So that piece of when it gets scary. Here's another, I'm going to play a couple of interviews here just so you get a sense of that state. This is Laura and her
I was
experience.
17 years old, and upon re-entering the States from that 2 months in Honduras, I did have a psychotic break from reality, and that was my first experience with that non-ordinary state. You can compare falling in love and the day you wake up from just falling in love and like being with your lover, and just that intensity and that euphoria, and that if you look, everything like the sun and the trees is just like a little bit more vibrant, and everything is a little bit more beautiful. And if you were to just take that shift, and if you were just to turn the volume all the way up on that, that's a similar relatable experience to what I had experienced. I felt ultra connected. Like I felt peace, calm, oneness, euphoria. I felt this like mission and this calling to save the world or like bring everybody together. What I felt with my family and parents was frustration, because I felt like there was this huge thing that I wanted to communicate to them, and nobody was getting it. Like I was speaking a different language, and so I felt frustrated.
Yeah. So what she's talking about is there's really no language to explain this state that the shaman goes into when they're in trance, or when somebody in a psychological crisis goes into one of these states, that feeling of losing your ego self boundaries and blending with the all. I've never experienced it, but what I understand, it's very hard to explain. So, like she said, your sensitivities are all turned up. You're sensitive to other people, like you can feel what other people are feeling. And so when she couldn't get it across to her parents what she was feeling or experiencing, and they got frightened, she picked up on that fear, and that's what sent her into this spiral of fear. And that's what sends people in these states into their paranoias and deep suffering. So the other thing I've heard from the people who have gone through these states is I wouldn't trade it for anything. I mean, I learned so much going through this. As hard as it was, I wouldn't trade it for anything. Here's another individual
I've had,
from
2 or 3
Amsterdam.
psychotic episodes, and there's 2 moments that have, or even 3 moments that really have stayed with me. And one was when I was at an ex-boyfriend's place. I really felt like it was the love of my life back then, and he was drifting away, and he was at that point very clear to me, like, I'm seeing somebody else now, and it's over. And yeah, and you're sleeping on the couch tonight. I'm not letting you go in this state. And that news really sank in that night, and I couldn't sleep. And at one point, I really felt like I had wasted my life on boyfriends and on things that really weren't important. Petty issues, like did somebody like me or not, and I felt like I had to concentrate on other things, on making a difference in the world, and on doing good. And it was a very powerful feeling. Like it lifted the heartache, but then instead there was this urge, because I felt really guilty of having wasted a lot of the biggest part of my life not doing anything that was really important or really good. And so then in the morning I got up and I started running around in the city, talking to people, talking about the potential I saw in them and the good I saw in them. But then nobody would understand, of course. In that psychotic break, I humiliated myself, and I talked nonsense to people and all, but the preparedness I felt and the courage I felt are things that I'm able to go back to. And after that, I used to be a very introverted person, but since that psychotic break, I've gained in courage. I've gotten more in touch with the idealistic part of me. I started organizing conferences. I started speaking up at work. I took on new positions in which I could try to change things.
Okay. Yeah, so Karen actually started a Crazy Wise conference when we started showing when we started doing the film 4 years ago. I'll be back there in a month or 2. In the Netherlands, there's now 14 different screenings going on, and other conferences spawned by what she started. So she's really, here's another individual.
Yeah, I had 2 openings, one when I was about 24 and the other when I was about 38. What medicine calls mania and what I call opening is an opening of the mind. It begins to be receptive to possibilities it would not have considered before. And also, when it has time, and I think this happens, first the mind opens and then the heart begins to open. So suddenly you can go from feeling wonderful to feeling awful. Because, either people see it as an opportunity to bully you, or they may be well-intentioned and panicking themselves, and their panic is infectious. You begin to panic because they've panicked. Or they just, they don't like a rapid change in personality. You've gone from being one person that they knew well to being someone that's suddenly more confident and more decisive and talking a blue streak, and they don't like that. I would never give up this experience that I had for any amount of bribery. You couldn't give me $1 billion to say that this did not happen. Go back and change the past, or even to blunt my memory of it. It is the most precious thing that has ever happened in my life. I can spend more and more time in a lucid state where I can speak freely. You're talking to someone right now that if you'd had this spoken to me 3 years before, I wouldn't have been able to get a word out. It would have been, the words that would have come out would have been rigid and not so interesting. The stuttering would have been impossible to get through. Now I don't have that anymore. That in itself is worth, by itself is worth all the suffering that I went through.
Okay, so I've been told I have to wrap up real quick. I have a few other things. The other thing that happens, the person's sense of inhibitions completely drop. His stuttering, he couldn't get a word out, hardly. He'd been to speech therapists for years. That went away in his psychological crisis. I have a lot more to say about it, but I'm out of time. I don't want to romanticize these crises, but there is something there that we have to honor. We have to spend more time with people in these crises to find out what's going on, and just know that they're not this abnormal creature. They're people with special abilities that we have marginalized. So thank you very much. I wish I could finish, but I haven't got the time. Yeah.
So we'll go straight to questions now. So if you have a question, please either tweet us at #YFSBor or just raise your hand and ask your question and state your name.
Yes, Dimitri.
Phil, I think you mentioned... Dimitri, can we get you on the microphone so people can hear? Thank you. Phil, thank you so much. An amazing presentation. I think one of the things you mentioned was that you also studied mindfulness and meditation. And I think Adam pointed out that he went into this meditation retreat where he spent about, I think, 10 days in a silent retreat.
Right.
I'd be curious if you can elaborate maybe a little bit more on this connection between perhaps spirituality, meditation, and how that relates to, I guess, some of the mental issues that you talked about.
Right, right. Yeah, the thing about meditation, so somebody like Adam or anybody that goes into one of these states is all of a sudden they've had whatever the reason, and it could be childhood trauma, it could be current trauma, losing your boyfriend, getting bad grades in school, can send somebody into one of these altered states. And it's essentially something that takes away your sense of who you thought you were. I'm a good student, I've got a great personality, whatever, I have status. If any of those aspects of who you think you are immediately ripped away from you, you can go into one of these altered states. So it's an immediate ego reduction. Meditation is a process by which you slowly disable the ego in a very methodical way. And it's been developed in Asian countries, in Buddhist culture, in Hindu culture for years. And it's a way for you to get over the self-consciousness we all have and to lower that methodically over a period of time by just paying attention to the chatter in your mind. And the fact that Adam was to do it so quickly in one of these 10-day retreats, it was quick, but it was also temporary. In this story in the film, he has relief for a period of time, but he starts slipping back into his old way of thinking. And that's what created the story of Crazy Wise. But that's essentially the way I look at it now, is that is a very practiced way of reducing that sense of self-aggrandizement. The Tibetans call it self-grasping, self-cherishing. That's what they meditate and do their mantras for over and over. They're very devotional in what they do. And it produces a whole different state of mind. More compassion, more feelings of being connected to the whole, more responsibility, like Laura said, I wanted to save the world. There's a lot of people that go through these things, all of a sudden feel like they are the second coming of Christ. If they get into delusions of grandeur and the ego starts coming back in force. So that's how I think of meditation anyway. Yeah.
We have a question from Twitter here from Ugo T. Phil, if someone is feeling these psychotic breakdowns and has to take meds that really aren't helping, what do you recommend they do?
It's a very complicated question, and I'm glad somebody asked that. Of all the people we interviewed in this film, and we interviewed many, just formally about 80 people, but informally hundreds, no one said that medications don't have a place in practice. They are very useful when you're in a crisis situation. You can't sleep. If you haven't slept for days, definitely you need to get some sleep. Where they're not as useful is chronically. They have severe side effects physically, diabetes, gaining weight. There's a whole host of side effects that come along with medications. So, so somebody that's in one of these crises needs to be with somebody that is a professional. If they want to start coming off their meds, they have to get with somebody that knows how to do that in a very symptomatic way, or a very systematic way, I should say. So it can be very dangerous coming off medications. But to get support and there's another thing that's happening is peer support. Being around somebody that's been through it, much like the shaman, the young shaman, they get an older shaman. You get a peer that has been through one of these experiences, they can really help somebody go through it. One more question. Yeah. Yes?
Hello, my name is Arseny, and I had a question. Do you believe that people or shamans that say that they enter the second state is an actual thing, or is it just play to give other people belief or hope in something?
That's a very good question. Is the shaman essentially effective because they're using placebo effect? You believe in the power of the shaman, so you get better? Or are they actually going into a different state? I used to think the former, that it was all placebo, with the way they got their powers. I am now being converted to think there's really, they go into this other state. Some people call it a spiritual place, but it's a state of mind where they feel totally connected. And in that space, there is information. The other thing that happens to people that go in that space is their creativity shoots up through the roof. Artists are typically people that are on that line, that they can go into those spaces. And in that space, they get information that we wouldn't rationally think of. So I think there's definitely a state of mind there that has a lot of value. And whether you get there through years of meditation or you're propelled into it through whatever crisis, or some people are using, now ayahuasca is very popular in culture now. It's the new LSD in a way. That's another way of getting into those states. I don't recommend it, but that's happening now. And so I think there is something to being in that state of mind, yeah. Is that it for questions?
Thank you very much for sharing your insight and experience with us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.